So now on to today's event, and I'm delighted to welcome Kirsty Archer-Thompson as our speaker. Kirsty is Collections and Interpretation Manager for the Abbotsford Trust. The Trust is an independent charity responsible for protecting and managing the former home and estate of Sir Walter Scott. Abbotsford is a Category A listed house and a designed landscape near Melrose in the Scottish borders. Kirsty is ultimately responsible for the care, conservation and curation of the collections, interiors, built and natural heritage of Scott's former home and estate. She was formerly also National Project Manager for the developmental phase of the Walter Scott 250 anniversary activity that I mentioned earlier. So over to you, Kirsty, and I hope we have no IT gremlins.
If we do, we will overcome them. Thank you so much, Neil, and thank you to everybody at HES for inviting me to come and be a part of this programme today. And indeed, Happy New Year to you all. And if anyone's catching up on YouTube, it's lovely to have you with us too. If you are seeing a few funny annotations appearing on the slides, I'm so sorry. I seem to have enabled a function I wasn't even aware existed on Zoom. So if you are hovering over the slides with your mouse, please be careful not to click, because you might be accidentally drawing a picture for somebody else to see. So let's get going. The Delilah of My Imagination. It's certainly a poetic quote, but let's be honest, it has more than a passing undercurrent of menace. The biblical Delilah in the Book of Judges, or indeed in the Talmud, is a coercive femme fatale who betrays her husband Samson to the Philistines, laying bare the secret source of his superhuman strength, which is all bound up in his hair. The 19th century literary superstar Sir Walter Scott makes use of this phrase more than once in his private correspondence in reference to his home at Abbotsford. And these references are often playful. For example, in one instance, Abbotsford is, quote, like Mrs. Sampson, certainly very pretty. Most poignantly, though, he evokes it in a heart-wrenching entry in his personal journal, which I now can't get to. There we go. And at this point, he's contemplating the prospect of financial and reputational ruin in the wake of the 1825 banking crash. Here is an excerpt from that crushing realization in Scott's own words. And I'll just skim down to the second section, which is more relevant for us, but please do read the whole if you can. It has been my Delilah, and so I have often turned. Now the recollection of the extensive woods I planted formed, from which strangers must derive both the pleasure and profit, will excite feelings likely to sober my gayest moments. I have half resolved never to see the place again. How could I tread my hall with such a diminished crest? I must end this, or I shall lose the tone of mind with which men should meet distress. And perhaps most notably, this is an extraordinary thing to say about a home, casting bricks and mortar in the role of a seductress, a temptress, even a lover. But then Abbotsford was always more than just a home to Sir Walter Scott. And that's why I think these particular Delilahn references to a place that was a crutch, a muse, and an obsession all at the same time are so compelling. They beautifully underline the intense relationship, particular house you're looking at here, and its literary creator. And that's something of what I hope to illuminate in today's talk. Through project managing the design and build of a home straight from the pages of his imagination, and by filling it with stories and tremendous historical resonance, Scott was able to actually draw down inspiration for his novels, histories, and his topographical work, with the house's architecture, interiors, and collections acting as his food for thought. As his estate in the Scottish borders grew and the lofty towers of Abbotsford rose up, it's no coincidence that Scott was also at his peak as a best-selling novelist. So if Scott was known as the Wizard of the North, then Abbotsford was undoubtedly his wizard's staff. And today I hope to give you just a flavour of that magic. As Neil said, it's my role in a day job to conserve, to care for, curate and research this built and natural heritage, from the design landscape of our estate and Georgian gardens to the fabric of the buildings, the historic interiors, and our tens of thousands of collection items housed within. And when you spend so much time at such an iconic place, more time than you do in your own home, I would hasten to add, you begin to appreciate the mind and the personality of the creator in a much more involved way. From the views from the attics and the turrets to the door to oblivion for historic Tolbooth prison, which we'll come back to later. There are many different ways of seeing Abbotsford, many different ways that it can, and indeed it should, be read, almost like a literary text in its own right. And with too much to say and far too little time, which is a common problem with Scott, for any of you out there that work on him in some sort of academic capacity, I'm sure you'll agree, it's specifically this invitation to read Scott's home that I want to focus on today, in order that we might understand the impulses that lie behind this iconic design, this building that you see on the slide there. So let's go on a virtual journey, charting the evolution of a building that was to become the architectural blueprint for the Scottish baronial revival. Although, of course, we have to look a little further back to the 18th century to find its roots in the broader Gothic revival and the beginnings of it. And certainly, if you're interested in these architectural and artistic movements, both the medieval revival as a whole and the arts and crafts movement both pay homage to Scott's literature and his achievements at Abbotsford. So there are many, many reasons to celebrate this building. We go to the spring of 1811, and that is when we first hear Scott talk of what would become Abbotsford. He was approaching 40 years of age. I often joke it's midlife crisis territory, almost exactly, and hastened along by the termination of his lease at Ashes Teal, which was on the left here, his summer home near Selkirk, where the family had dreamily happy. Scott reveals his determination to purchase a farm and adjoining land on the banks of the River Tweed between Melrose and Selkirk. And it's only actually about 6 miles along the river from Ashes Teal. Originally, Scott hoped to purchase 2 farms if he could stretch his finances to make it possible. But eventually he settled on the site closest to the Turn Again stone, there on the right. And this is a marker from the Battle of Melrose in 1526 that he had visited with his father as a young boy and had made quite the impression on his historical imagination. So the site of Cartloch was not particularly attractive to others in Scott's orbit, I think it's fair to say. It was uninhabited, rather ramshackle. This farmhouse or cottage was basic and somewhat poky for a family of 6, and it was flanked by a humble kale yard that very much reinforced that rusticity. The land associated with the farm was bare heath, save for a strip of ominous-looking fir trees. The eyebrows of Scott's friends were raised at the £4,000 price tag. It was actually £4,200, which was a lot of money at the time, for this bleak little property and its associated land. Was delighted at the opportunity to carve out a place to call his own in the borders. Scott's love of the River Tweed is well documented, but it may surprise you to hear that such was this love that the current site of Abbotsford House was not originally as he intended. Cartley Hole had not been occupied by its previous owner, and it had fallen into some state of disrepair. So the initial ambition was to raze the whole thing to the ground and instead to build a villa directly on the banks of the Tweed below the original house. As far as I'm aware, although there's still some further archival work to do, so we're not putting the nail in the coffin here, but no designs for this structure have yet come to light. But we do know that the 2 men working with very early plans for the cottage that never was were Daniel Terry, who was a recent actor acquaintance who had entered Scott's orbit via some of his acting work on stage dramatisations of Scott's Waverley novels and poetry, and the sickly but immensely talented classical architect William Stark. While Scott waited 9 months or so to relocate from Ashes Teal to this new property at Cartley Hole, the trio tried to determine how best to protect any new dwelling from old Father Tweed. Their flood defences and the new building itself seem to have been abandoned in this period, probably because of the steep expense involved. But you can see the early enthusiasm for the project in the quote on the slide there. The sole survivor of this aborted plan was the stable block, which still survives at Abbotsford, now ruinous and at risk, in large part due to its position on the floodplain. And if you see in this engraving here in the close-up, the original roofs of these buildings look a little bit like the Mediterranean hipped roofs, and they betray Stark's more neoclassical design. That Scott should have had the stables constructed so early at the newly rechristened Abbotsford also reminds us of his love of animals and his desire for them in comfort and proximity, very close to the planned original dwelling. But in these early days, it was very much land that piqued Scott's interest. Attracted by the fertility of the ground, he determined to begin planting about 3/4 of its total acreage with trees. His plans for the building itself, once he decided to remodel the existing farmstead, were surprisingly modest and always tempered in those early days by activities outdoors. So he talked enthusiastically of a garden that would enclose this house, of a conservatory space overlooking an ornamental fountain, an extravagance not just on the wish list of Mrs. Scott, it seems, although we know that the future Lady Scott was very enthusiastic about the fountain. The cottage as it stood was fairly classically proportioned. So there's its floor layout on the left there. So it's a 2 up, 2 down at heart. You have a kitchen, diner and a drawing room on the ground floor. And we know that Scott used a little section of the drawing room as a writing space for when he was working at home. The kitchen on the ground floor also had a fold down bed to call upon in a hosting emergency, and a small sitting area for the children to escape their parents, or perhaps vice versa. And then all 6 members of the Scott family quartered upstairs with the help of a hastily thrown up partition wall. Still, it must have been quite a squeeze for everyone concerned, as the siblings were for the most part adolescents, so you've got squabbles and everything else going on there. Just to give you some sense of the sizes of these rooms, each of the downstairs rooms are 12 foot square each, approximately. So these aren't palatial spaces by any stretch. And on the upper floor, you might just be able to make out, depending on the size of your device you're using to watch this, it's the boys' bedroom that's biggest. So Scott's 2 sons get the best end of the deal. And then actually the smallest bedroom on the top left-hand corner is the one used by Scott and Lady Scott. So they basically gave away a lot of the upstairs space to the children. Scott determined that 2 spare bedrooms would be all that was necessary, seemingly quite relaxed about finding additional room for guests, who, with his classic boarder's affability, he claimed would find somewhere to sleep if they really wanted to stay. Despite his declining health, William Stark was employed by Scott to assist with the gentle transformation of the existing cottage into, quote, an English-style vicarage. Now, Stark was the mentor of William Playfair, the man responsible for the divine of the Signet Library, and he duly acquiesced. And also Stark was involved in other fantastic projects. The Hunterian in Glasgow is just an example of that. The cottage was given a new lease of life during this early period, with the addition of a romantic portico, as can be seen here on the image. Those columns at the front there, although they look like they might be of stone, are actually historic tree trunks that were provided by Alexander Pringle of Whitebank. And they came from the historic forests around Yare House in the Borders. And that was land that had belonged to the Pringles since the 16th century. And this was one of the first instances of Walter Scott acquiring wood from estates or trees with very specific historical resonance. And this is something that he does enthusiastically from here on in. And then something very special happens that changes the fortunes of Abbotsford in 1813, the untimely death of its first architect, William Stark. Scott's own enthusiasms had always represented the idea of his dual locality. He was a son of Edinburgh, but a descendant of border stock. So in him, 2 worlds collided, that hotbed of Enlightenment philosophy in the Athens of the North, and the older traditions and folklore of the south of Scotland. So in Scott, we have a man both fascinated by inventions and new technology, but also fueled by an early and a very powerful compulsion to preserve songs, to salvage possessions and heirlooms and belongings, and to consider the architectural heritage and try and preserve and stop it from fragmenting and being demolished of those past generations, and to also hold true to the values and ideals that to some Regency thinkers seemed increasingly outdated or obsolete. Perhaps with all this tension and conflict within him percolating away, he began to dream of what Abbotsford could be, surrounded by evidence of the past, written very obviously on the borders landscape around him, from Iron Age forts to Roman roads and medieval abbeys. And it was this shift, the historian, the archaeologist, and very much the romantic in him, that began to take the reins as he began to dream of reimagining himself as a borders laird. Certainly we know that Scott had been an avid antiquarian for many years by this point, and his introduction to the theatre impresario Daniel Terry in the summer of 1811, as I said before, was a friendship that was to have a huge impact on the direction of Abbotsford's development after Stark's death, and indeed influenced the makeup of its museum collections over the next 20 years. Indeed, it is to Terry in November 1816 that we first hear of further building works planned at Abbotsford. Through Terry, Scott had been introduced to Edward Blore, another antiquary and a talented draftsman, now remembered principally for his work at Buckingham Palace. Scott confirmed to Terry that he had employed Blore and the cabinet maker and sculptor, George Bullock, who is looking wonderful in this very Byronic style portrait, I believe, the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool. And they were to lead on the design of a new west extension, conceived as a building that would connect the existing cottage with the low building, which is a kind of farmsteading at a right angle to the main house, which is on the footprint of what is now part of Abbotsford's Victorian or Hope Scott wing, and also part of our garden walls. So that structure no longer exists. And this building that effectively bridged the gap and created an L shape on the sort of footprint of the building at this time contained those two guest bedrooms that Scott needed so badly. And he referred to this part of his building habitually as the chapel, due to salvaged stonework features he actually incorporated into the lost structure. The original concept of joining the two structures seems to have been the brainchild of another of Scott's antiquarian friends and another talented artist, James Skene of Rubislaw. So you can see the cottage itself on the right-hand side there. You get the sense of the L shape, the long building at 90-degree angle, and then you can see this patchwork in the middle, this Gothic structure that was designed to link the two buildings together. In the year of that, in the same year that the fate of Edinburgh's notorious Tolbooth prison was sealed, apologies for that, Scott and Skene had already determined to try and salvage some of its stonework and carvings and incorporate them into this new building phase as soon as the demolition had taken place. And they actually asked for the Edinburgh magistrates to relocate some of this material to the borders. Now, naturally, the magistrate was delighted to have such a hand in the cleanup operation, and cartloads of stone duly arrived at Abbotsford and were predominantly reappropriated into the West Tower, which this is a view from the flat roof section at the back of the house, where you get a really nice view of this tower structure. And we believe this to be modelled on that great border tradition, the defensive peel tower. And ours has the addition of these rather perilous external steps up the side. They look like they'd be fairly easy to climb, but I promise you when you get close up, they are on a scale of a sort of giant's footing. They're terrifying things. Supposedly Scott liked to take his friends up to the top to view the Tweed by moonlight, which is a crazy idea in terms of any kind of health and safety mindset, if you ask me. We think that these stairs are most probably modelled on those that feature at Queen Margaret Tudor's tower at Linlithgow Palace. Scott knew his 16th century history very, very well, of course, and the associations of this vantage point with the tragedy of Queen Margaret Tudor, who was waiting in the tower in vain for her husband James IV to return from Flodden Field, And all of this is part of a web of illusion that Scott very much intended the viewer and the visitor to appreciate. It was all there to be interpreted. By this point, Scott had also acquired part of the original gateway to Parliament Hall with the arms of King Charles I, and features from the College Hall of the University of Edinburgh, amongst many other salvaged architectural fragments that were coming out of a sustained demolition and architectural. These features would shift position over the coming years of Abbotsford as they found more permanent homes, and they represent the beginning of a concerted effort to salvage antique masonry from buildings across Scotland and indeed from further afield. The plans for the first extension to the cottage, therefore, seem to have been fairly frenetic, and early on in the discussions, another name quickly enters stage left, the architect William Atkinson. Little plan here, I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see it. I'm hoping looking at this on a slightly larger screen, but you can see to the right hand side there the cottage footprint. We've already had a good look at that. The pink area in the middle is the joining structure, and this isn't quite as built. The reason we know this is because it's missing a corridor section, what we now call the religious corridor. But other than that, which is through the dining room wall, it largely represents what was eventually built. And the rooms that Scott was most excited about here are very much the addition of a proper dining and socialising space, a new study area, but also the boudoir or armory, as we'll come on to. And we know that with William Atkinson, his proposed designs for everything from bookcases to sideboards, archways and niches, they all seem to give the Scott family much more ingenious use of space than those that were originally proposed by Edward Blore. And Atkinson was duly employed beside Blore and Bullock, effectively as a principal architect within this little team. Inspired by Atkinson's work at nearby Bow Hill, the seat of the Duke of Buccleuch, Scott requested an exterior finish for this new part of his house, with a belt of granite and freestone, or at least the effect of this, and he wanted the building in appearance to resemble, quote, an old English hall. However, Edward Blore's talent for sympathetically and accurately reimagining the architecture of late medieval Scottish buildings quickly made an impression, and the emphasis subtly shifted. This first extension was going to give the family an awful lot more breathing room than they'd had to date. They would have 2 new bedchambers, including their associated dressing rooms, additional much needed spaces for household activities, and of course, those more principal spaces, the dining and entertaining spaces that Scott is so excited about. And I think it was particularly the finished effect of the interiors that excited him most. If we go on to the next slide, we'll see there's a watercolor illustration of the Armory once it was decorated. And on the right here, his plaster cast grotesques. And the Armory is famous for this suite that all come from, they're all casts from Melrose Abbey, and indeed the stained glass and the other kind of ecclesiastical flourishes at Abbotsford. The structure that began to take shape between 1817 and 1818 was a really curious beast, asymmetrical in the extreme, although this particular image on the left here that shows that west tower like an eagle's eyrie above the cottage does slightly exaggerate the proportional difference. Scott acknowledged its facade was rather fantastic, but did comfort himself with its pleasing irregularity. He says here, I have always had a private dislike to the regular shape of a house, although no doubt it would be wrong-headed to set about building an irregular one from the beginning. But when the cottage enlarges itself and grows out of circumstances, which is the case of Abbotsford, the outs and ins afford without so much variety and depth of shade, and within give such an odd variety of snug accommodation that they far exceed, in my estimation, the cut-lugged bandbox with 4 rooms on a floor and 2 stories rising regularly above one another. From this you will be disposed to augur something rather whimsical, and I believe you will be perfectly right. So whilst the family were crushed inside that original cottage like sardines during the building work of 1817, they didn't shirk their social engagements. They were welcoming guests such as Lady Byron, the artist David Wilkie, and the American author Washington Irving, all with good humour, and they were living and breathing that heady excitement of a renovation project. Washington Irving actually penned a fascinating account of staying with Scott and his family during this hectic time, and his reminiscences were eventually published in 1835. These family guests were potentially offered the garret space. This gets referred to more than once in Scott's correspondence. And this probably means the attic space directly above Scott's sleeping quarters, which this is the access point to on the left. Definitely not for those that have overindulged at the distance. Scott had also during this time continued to add farms and plantations to his estate, and towards the end of 1816 he was thrilled to purchase Rymer's Glen. This is Turner's beautiful watercolor vignette that accompanies Scott's poetical works of Rymer's Glen, and this is an area that is brimming with folkloric associations of fairies and enchantment. And if you don't know the story of Thomas the Rhymer, I'm not going to spoil it for you. That will be a very pleasurable piece of homework for you following this talk. By the winter of 1817, Scott was thinking about furnishing his new spaces, somewhat prematurely, but I think we'd all agree it's the fun bit of any kind of renovation project. His boudoir was now almost definitely imagined as an armory or a cabinet in the original sense of the word, and he was busying himself with how best to mount his various pieces of arms and armour. Throughout this period, we must not forget, he was also attempting to write in his new study space, surrounded by the ceaseless sound of hammers and saws. And this is the era. It's extraordinary that he's managing to find the headspace to create such monumental pieces of literature. 1818 was also the year that he set about working with his estate factor on the creation of a labourers' hamlet on the estate that was to be christened Abbottstown. By the summer of 1819, the building phase, this first one at the house, was complete, but Scott could not rest. Having rediscovered the honours of Scotland in Edinburgh Castle in February 1818 and received the promise of a baronetcy from the king for his services in this regard, Scott had started referring to his building already, must have slightly depressed the architects. He was calling it a half house, quotation marks, having decided to demolish the old cottage as soon as financial circumstances allowed. A year later, he commissioned a new ice house, which he could not fill, much to his frustration, due to the lack of snowfall in the winter of 1820. But 1821 proved a more fruitful year, and the snow was duly packed in. And that ice not only filled the decanters on the dinner table, but also tended to the fevers and the illnesses of the family and their dependents on the estate. By 1821, the new Sir Walter Scott was ready to start realising his ambition for the house, asking that his estate factor urgently commission a map of ground levels around the house for the use of William Atkinson. I have got a very good plan for Atkinson, and I do not like the outside, which is modern Gothic, a style I hold to be equally false and foolish. Laura and I have been at work to Scottify it, by turning battlements into bartizans and so on. I think we have struck out a picturesque, appropriate, and entirely new line of architecture. The map of levels was duly produced by John Smith of Darnick, and it's what you can see on the slide here. And I'm hoping in the middle section here, I'll just try and use my little annotation tool. Hopefully this will work. So the original cottage, I'm hoping you can see my mouse moving there, is just below the letter D, if you aren't seeing any movement. And this dotted line that goes further out the way is the proposed new building. So you can see that it effectively, once the cottage is right away, encases its footprint and extends further east. And that we only have one walled garden at this point. The rest of the walled gardens come a little bit later. And then you can see all the service buildings that have since been wiped away by the Victorian extension to a large extent, very much present beside the house. William Atkinson and Edward Blore used this plan to set about creating the grand east extension of Abbotsford, once the original Cartley Hole cottage had finally been razed to the ground in early 1822. Who would have thought 10 years for eventually giving way? This new extension, let me just shut that annotation tool. My slides are stuck, I think. There we go. This new extension was to create 3 public rooms on the ground floor and a reimagined study space for the celebrity writer, who was now at the height of his fame. Although the proportions and the aspect of the study and the library were slightly altered over a series of plans, anyone that knows the Abbotsford Library well today will know that it entirely looks out over the River Tweed, long ways horizontally within the interiors. But at one time it was meant to orientate 90 degrees differently. And indeed, another concept that appears in our design books is a staircase that goes from the first floor library bow window down to ground level. So there's lots of subtle shifts in a lot of this conceptual art for the house and architectural plans. Upstairs, Scott would have his own bedroom quarters above the study. Lady Scott would get a more spacious suite, and a new principal guest bedroom would look out over the Tweed. One of the early insistencies of Scott was his Tower of Shields, which was the octagonal tower, and this is such a famous part of Abbotsford, on that southeast corner of the building, the base of which forms his curious oratory in the study. And from the Victorian period right up until the later 20th century, this was the space that the family chose to display Scott's bronze death mask in. Now, this tower was originally conceived of to celebrate the heraldic identity of his closest friends, with the idea that just at ground level there's a series of plaques, and they would on each face have a different armorial identity. But there's no evidence that those coats of arms were ever carved, perhaps because of Scott's financial difficulties not long after the build. But the tower itself is still called the Tower of Shields to this day. By July 1822, Scott was most definitely feeling the weight of project management at home. He was panicking over the lack of progress on the roof. He was frantically communicating with Atkinson, seeking updates and instructions that were then having to wend their way down to the architect's home in Regent's Park in London. And at the same time as he was doing all of this, he was, of course, putting together ambitious plans for the 21 daft days of King George IV's visit to Scotland, the first the coronation of Charles II. And this is a monumental task in itself. It's like organising the Olympics in 6 weeks. So the fact that Scott was managing to keep on top of all of this is, quite frankly, eye-watering. By the winter of 1822-3, the shell of the new building and the first coat of plaster were complete, and that spring heralded the enclosure of the gardens as the 3 walled spaces we know of today, and the construction of a beautiful garden pavilion that we think is probably based on, aesthetically and design-wise, based on a medieval campaign tent. This was also the time where there was an intensive interior decoration focus, and they were employing the talents of David Ramsay Hay of the Nick firm in Edinburgh. James Skene and Daniel Terry remained intimately involved in all of the antiquarian treasure hunting and salvage that would furnish Abbotsford, as did Sir Walter himself. He also found time for that. The result of all of this was that by 1824, Scott said himself, quote, he had included everything except that which was tedious. Abbotsford was a sort of picnic dwelling of pillaged and ransacked ideas and associations. Architecturally, although the building evokes many of the late medieval buildings of his native land that Edward Blore had helped to reimagine, the aspects of that old English manor, the genesis of the idea, are not even in the final east extension. This is a view from the South Court, the main entrance to Abbotsford. Just look at that row of Elizabethan-style chimneys, not to mention the Tudor arches that can be found externally and across the interiors. One of the cleverest things about Abbotsford is that each elevation, so each view of the house from a different viewpoint, takes you somewhere else in time. As you walk through the gardens and turn to look back at the house, echoes of a manor house are suddenly silenced by somewhere that looks like a 12th century castle straight out of a medieval chronicle. And that's very much apparent in the large image on the right here. On the north side, and you get the best view right down by the river, which is the top left image, it's more of a Renaissance palace with its piano nobile, with all the principal rooms on that first floor. And of course, the fascinating thing is that Scott sets his novels in all these various periods in English and Scottish history. It's like walking around a memory palace. The theme continues, and the carvings he is embedded in the structure of the building itself. They pop up out of the stonework, like characters in a novel. And the casual visitor has no idea what is new, what is old, what's truth, what's fiction. That's why Abbotsford is quite simply one of the best expressions of a writer's house anywhere in the world. On the left here, we've got a 17th century marriage lintel stone, the arms of Scotland, which have most definitely come from an Edinburgh demolition during Scott's years in the city, probably early 16th century. On the right here, we have a nice close-up of the original toll booth door, the door to Edinburgh's jail, that came to Abbotsford during that period that I was talking about a little bit earlier on, and is actually built up. It's a door to nowhere because it doesn't open, and it's built on the first floor of the house, right outside the window of Scott's original bedroom. So very much a kind of leveler for him, I think, as he was gazing out on the landscape, to remember that some people passed through that door and never came out the other side. The fact that Abbotsford was developed in phases during Scott's own lifetime helped it to set down these deep roots, giving the impression of a layered country dwelling that had stood for generations. That Scott wanted his new house to feel organic and improved upon over time, that's hardly surprising. New wings and remodeled architectural features could all be witnessed at the ancestral seats of his friends, not to mention the palaces and fortifications he so enjoyed visiting with fellow antiquarians. Scott, as a true romantic, set about very much with his family and feeling his way forwards as time and opportunity allowed, even if he was always keen to start the masons hammering before the money had come in. Inside, Scott had done much the same thing, reimagining and invoking the past within the safe confines of his state-of-the-art Georgian home, with its compact baronial hall festooned with heraldry, arms, armour and animal skulls. Scott's love of the theatre and the influence of artist friends who were also stage set painters, not to mention that of Daniel Terry, ensured that Abbotsford, both inside and out, seems to be what it is not. Plaster is painted to mimic beamed and ribbed oak and cedarwood ceilings. Stone features from buildings such as Melrose Abbey and Roslin Chapel are copied and then scaled up or down in painted plaster, courtesy of that talented sculptor, George Bullock. And soft fir planking, so easy to hammer nails and fixtures into, is papered and weathered, given an aged paint effect, so it looks like antique oak panelling. In this melding of design and theatricality, Scott can be viewed alongside William Beckford of Fonthill Abbey and Horace Walpole of Strawberry Hill House. Both of these eccentrics of the 18th century built their own fantastical homes, but they were also writers and prolific collectors of art and antiquities. So why? Why create something illusory while at the same time obsessing over the architectural detailing in an attempt to avoid it becoming false or foolish? Why would you pepper a remarkable collection of authentic and rare objects and curiosities with replicas of material held elsewhere? And that's something in a few instances. In some ways, these issues go right to the heart of understanding what Scott was all about. At the same time as he was a historian, a reviewer, and a social commentator, he was a novelist and a storyteller. He created literary pseudonyms so that publications under increasingly hilarious names could actively compete with his own works, credited to, at that time, the mysterious author of Waverley. The web of intrigue he manages to weave is quite phenomenal. And part of recreating and salvaging material from other sites seems to be about bringing their potential stories under his roof, or at least attaching them to it. All of these things that surrounded him or that a visitor might stumble upon in the wider estate, they were all mnemonics or springboards for story. And in the end, whether items or features were replica or original ceased to matter. They were vehicles for story nevertheless. Even during Scott's own lifetime, Abbotsford was becoming one of the most recognised buildings in Britain and on the continent, courtesy of its appearance in countless engravings, both in editions of Scott's works and in a whole plethora of guidebooks. The story goes that when a very ill Sir Walter Scott was travelling through continental Europe on the way back from Italy in 1832, he was offered an engraving of his own home by a print seller who was none the wiser as to the identity of his customer. As the century went on, Abbotsford appeared on everything, from pillboxes to porcelain, cutlery, and postcards. And although Abbotsford itself has a fairly good representative collection of this kind of souvenir, the best and most comprehensive collection of this kind of material is held in the Coulson collection at the University of Edinburgh. Of course, even during its own era, Scott's era, Abbotsford had its critics. Here's a quote from a work published in 1829, only 3 years before Scott's death. "Disowned by all the orders, the mansion house of Abbotsford is a heresy in building. It is an order by itself, the first and destined probably to be the last of its race. It is entirely a creature of the poet's own fancy, built piecemeal by cantos, as it were." And again, there's that link between poetry or literature and the Abbotsford building itself. "And without regularity of design, it seems like a building in a state of unequal vegetation. Had any other than Sir Walter Scott been the designer, criticism might have lifted up her porcupine's quill against it and written down some of its singular combinations and proportions as whimsical or grotesque." Now, that's quite bruising, but perhaps one of the most vehement objectors to Scott's Abbotsford was John Ruskin. He was a passionate devotee of Scott's literature, but he found his home extremely distasteful. Ruskin visited in 1838, which is after Scott's death, and again later in life, and had the following to say in Modern Painters. "It was necessary that Scott should know nothing of art. He cared neither for painting nor sculpture, and was totally incapable of forming a judgment about them. He used love of Gothic architecture because it was dark, picturesque, old, and like nature, but he could not tell the worst from the best, and he built for himself, perhaps, the most incongruous and ugly pile that gentlemanly modernism ever designed. Ruskin found it heinous that crafts had been disguised. One thing appeared to be another, materials dressed up as something else. He didn't like that defensive architectural features had been utilised in a building that was so clearly domestic. That was an abomination to the finity of the true Gothic, and was in fact false Gothic, brash in its ostentatious display. Scott's playful theatricality and that whimsical desire to create a place that stimulated the mind and the senses, rather than necessarily seeking a higher truth, was completely at odds with Ruskin's views as expressed in his 7 Lamps of Architecture. So Abbotsford somehow cheapened Scott or betrayed the worst traits of his character, such as his unashamed glee in pomp and pageantry, which leads us right back to that Delilah of the Imagination quote I opened with. Abbotsford's distinctive profile changed again during Ruskin's lifetime. Scott's granddaughter, Charlotte Lockhart, and her husband, James Robert Hope, became the Hope Scotts, inheriting the house and estate from her younger brother in 1853. They had already set about an improvement scheme on the banking towards the river, creating a series of Victorian terraces and sweeping away the picturesque shrubbery and tree planting that had matured there over the last 3 decades. Once they formally inherited, they swiftly employed the Gothic revival architect William Burn, who was known to Scott's old friend James Skene, and Burn was commissioned to design a sympathetic extension to their grandfather's home, which would allow the family a private retreat from the thousands of literary pilgrims that arrived every year. That meant that the main staircase that had once marked the western end of Scott's home, and it sits actually very near the Peel Tower, the rectangular tower that sits on roof level. So it's at that end of the building. This was actually subsumed into this new private wing, as were some of the original bedrooms, which had never been shown to Victorian visitors. A game larder was constructed against the original ice house, and an underground passageway linked the house with these external. The Hope Scots also reconfigured access to the gardens, attempting to maintain them as largely private spaces. They did this through sinking a pathway alongside the arcade screen between the South Court and the East Court gardens. And you can see on the left there the flight of stairs that originally went down from one level to another. And then on the right, the railings marks this sunken passageway. And this meant that visitors could now enter the building through the basement level in what was at one time the wash house and the boiler room, and that was actually the route in. It's interesting to note that one of the key spaces in this burn extension, the Hope Scott Family Chapel, was originally intended to be a vaulted library for James Hope Scott, and things changed after the couple converted to Catholicism. Now it is the chapel's associations with St. John Henry Newman, a friend of the Hope Scots, that are its claim to fame. These days, it's an ambitious and independent charitable trust that is responsible for this as a 5-star visitor experience that aims to maintain the generous heart and atmosphere of Scott's original home. There are remarkably few barriers or glass cases in operation. We aim to get visitors as close as is safe to the antiquities, the furniture, and the objects that Scott collected and often wrote about, from the possessions of royalty, the spoils of battles, to examples of the very best craftsmanship in Georgian Britain. Because the house is one of the oldest publicly accessible writers' houses in the British Isles, aside from a certain someone's homes in Stratford-upon-Avon, probably don't know the name, the ground floor interiors that have been delighting devotees and aspiring writers since 1833, they remain largely preserved as they were left by Scott on his death in 1832. Over time, they've become a kind of time capsule, almost paralleled or unparalleled amongst historic houses, where so often later generations of the fabricative and aesthetic schemes on inherited properties. At Abbotsford, the ghost of Sir Walter was and remains a genial yet potent deterrent to such interventions. By the 1850s, we know there was an embryonic tour on offer, courtesy of a fairly ill-tempered housekeeper, and she would focus upon objects in the house that were most intimately connected with Scott's writing. Epic poems like Marmion and The Lady of the Lake to the 28 Waverley novels, titles such as Waverley, Rob Roy, Ivanhoe. Now is static or should be static. And in our ongoing work in interpretation, engagement and exhibition programmes, we continue to unpick Scott's own references and allusions to the content of this museum for living in, and revisit and discover stories and accounts recorded by visitors, family members and other commentators over time. All of this helps us to understand how this rich 3-dimensional storyboard was understood or read, to go back to our original point, by its earliest guests and visitors. And alongside this unusually literary approach to interpreting a museum collection, we also continue to research the provenance and contemporary significance of our items, working with scholars and institutions from around the world. As ever with Abbotsford, we have truth in one hand and we have fiction in the other, just as it should be. And if you're sitting there itching to hear more about our thousands of historical curiosities, from Napoleon's blotter to Mary Queen of Scots bedposts, I'm afraid that is the content of another paper, but luckily it is one that you can view for free on YouTube via the Society of Antiquaries channel, if you can bear to watch me. But really and truly, the best thing to do is to come and see the place for yourself. We open after our conservation programme is complete on March the 1st of this year. And I say you should come not just because it supports the work of our small charity, but also because I genuinely love what I do. And I think that Abbotsford is one of the most extraordinary places to explore and that there is something for everyone. The year 2021 was Pretty momentous in many ways, of course. We live in incredible times, don't we? But it was also hugely important for Scott. August the 15th marked 250 years since one of Scotland's greatest storytellers entered the world. And as Neil said earlier, celebrations and events continue into 2022. One of our major ambitions in the next phase of Abbotsford's journey is that we re-evaluate the author of Waverley's impact, relevance, and legacy in this anniversary period. And as he alluded to, we've been project managing a national campaign to do just that in partnership with organisations across the cultural landscape, with one of the most important aspects of our campaign foregrounding those more surprising and resonant aspects of Scott, his sympathetic treatment of outsiders and minorities, and his personal journey with mental health problems. This period of celebration and conversation, of which the event today is a part, allows us to shine a light on the many facets of Scott: subversive, surprising, contemporarily significant. So let's try and see Scott for what he really was, one of the most brilliant minds of the last 200 years, trying to make sense of the age-old conflicts. Things like, how do we balance what our heart and our head is telling us? How to square extremism with moderation, tradition and progress? And what is that complex relationship that we all have with nationhood? He asks us these powerful questions and he doesn't dictate the answers. How do we learn to live with our past? What does it mean to belong? What should we hold on to and why? And how do we overcome those very worst slings and arrows of outrageous fortune? In literature, in life, in legacy, he offers us the scope and the complexity to ask such expansive questions. I hope that today I've given you a sense there's always more to Scott and Abbotsford than meets the eye. To quote another great writer, J.R.R. Tolkien, who owes his own kind of literary debt to Scott, Abbotsford is most definitely a tale that grew in the telling, and it continues to grow today. Somehow, I think Walter Scott would be rather pleased with that. All that's left to say now is thank you to the lovely team at Historic Environments Scotland for inviting me to join their virtual events programme, and to all of you, wherever you are in the world, for listening. Thank you very much and take good care.